Okay. Here is book 2, starting with chapter 18. And basically the first 2 paragraphs are exactly the same as how chapter 1 began, describing the land of Nutsheni and the hills and the valleys and everything. And then the 3rd paragraph describes the house and the farm of James Jarvis. That's the man whose son was killed by Absalom. He is overseeing the plowing of his fields, and he worries about the drought conditions because the soil is very hard and very rough, and it's very difficult to plow. He describes how erosion of the land is getting worse and worse, and that no one is educated enough to fix the problem. He describes how people have stopped caring about the land. Nutsheni, where Khumalo is from and where Mr. Jarvis lives, has 2 farming systems. The first one is where a native could live in Nutsheni and work at a neighboring farm. And then the second system allows a native to get land from a farmer, a white farmer, and set up his home, and in exchange give back some labor to the farmer. But even with those 2 systems, things aren't working out well in Nutsheni, because how the young people and the men have left to go to the cities, there's no one left to work on the farmland. But those that actually did stay back to work on the farms aren't fulfilling their contracts anyway. They're not doing the work that they're supposed to anyway, so the whole system isn't working out. Mr. Jarvis dreams, or one of his dreams was that he would be able to give his son all of this farmland one day, because he does have a lot of land. And he's standing up on the hill looking down at his property, and he's just kind of daydreaming about how one day he wished he could give this to his son, but his son had other ideas. He wanted to become an engineer and move to the city. And so that's how they kind of parted ways. But just as he had that thought, he saw a police car coming up the hill. So we can get an idea that this is a police car coming to tell him about the death of his son. So we've already seen what happened with Khumalo and how he found out about Absalom. They've already caught Absalom. Khumalo has gone to visit him at the jailhouse. But here we kind of go back in time to see what happens with Mr. Jarvis when he finds out that his son has died. So he's standing up there on the hill kind of musing about the land and his son, and then he sees this police car and he's like, wow, okay, they're here. Let me go down the hill and see what they want. So he walks down the hill to meet with the officers, and the captain tells him that his son is dead. And Mr. Jarvis is obviously shocked, and it's just hard for him to take because that was his only child. The captain of the police arranged a plane for Mr. and Mrs. Jarvis to fly out to Johannesburg, while Mr. Jarvis told Mrs. Jarvis the bad news. And of course, she started sobbing and crying. So it's a pretty sad chapter. Chapter 19. At the airport, the Jarvises are met by their son's wife's brother named John Harrison. He expresses his condolences and said that Mary, their son's wife, and children have taken to death pretty badly. I mean, I'm sure that was her husband and that was their father. So when you have an unexpected death like that, I don't think anybody can take that in stride and be okay with it. We find out that Mr. Jarvis and his son didn't really see eye to eye on the native question, which is how we should treat the natives. Okay, again, it goes back to how some people believe that, we keep them down. They don't need to be educated. We use them for their labor and we just keep it at that. We live separate lives. But his son, Mr. Jarvis's son, didn't believe that. He felt that the natives should have more rights and that the Europeans should do more to help the natives. So when they get to the house, Mr. Harrison, Mary's father, told Mr. Jarvis how loved Mr. Jarvis's son was by the community. And many people sent condolence messages, and they came from natives, it came from colored people, which would be mixed. It came from Indians and even Jews. It says Jewish people sent messages of condolences. He tells Mr. Jarvis how his son was always fighting for the rights of the natives and how he had learned several of their languages. He had known Afrikaans, he learned Zulu, all to communicate with the different people that he was trying to help. So a lot of people looked up to him. Mr. Jarvis goes up to bed and tells his wife everything that Mr. Harrison had said about their son. She's proud of her son, but Mr. Jarvis is saddened that he wasn't close to his son. He's now regretting that he never really understood his son and never really took the time to get to know his son. So there's some regret there. And that ends chapter 19. Chapter 20. Mr. Jarvis wanted to see his son's house, so the police took him there. And he sat there. As he sat in the chair, his son's chair, he noticed all of the invitations for his son to speak at different places, to go to people's weddings. And it was from all types of different people, natives, Indian people. So he really got to see how involved his son was in the community. So as he's sitting there, he noticed all the books that his son had, and there was a whole bunch written about Abraham Lincoln. So I guess we can kind of see who his son's idol was, Abraham Lincoln. There were also many books about South Africa. There were books with poetry of Shakespeare, of course, and religion and Soviet Russia. So his son really read a lot and tried to learn as much as he could about the world. He found his son's manuscript about the truth about Native crime, and he read it. It was only a partial manuscript because some pages were missing. He couldn't find the rest, but he did read the page that he found. And as he read it, he saw that his son was explaining how he felt that the Europeans were justified in using the natives to build up the land and the cities, but they're not justified anymore in keeping them down. He said that it's not permissible to keep breaking up their families, knowing how bad that is. He was completely against the exploitation of the native people for cheap labor. And I'm going to read an excerpt on page 178 and 179 to help you get an idea of how Mr. Jarvis's son felt about the native question. It is not permissible to add to one's possessions if these things can only be done at the cost of other men. Such development has only one true name, and that is exploitation. It might have been permissible in the early days of our country, before we became aware of its cost, in the disintegration of native community life, in the deterioration of native family life, in poverty, slums, and crime. But now that the cost is known, it is no longer permissible. Okay, jumping a couple paragraphs ahead. It was permissible to allow the destruction of a tribal system that impeded the growth of the country. It was permissible to believe that its destruction was inevitable. But it is not permissible to watch its destruction and to replace it by nothing, or by so little that a whole people deteriorates physically and morally. The old tribal system was, for all its violence and savagery, for all its superstition and witchcraft, it was a moral system. Our natives today produce criminals and prostitutes and drunkards, not because it is their nature to do so, but because their simple system of order and tradition and convention has been destroyed. It was destroyed by the impact of our own civilization. Our civilization is therefore an inescapable duty to set up another system of order and tradition and convention. It is true that we hoped to preserve the tribal system by a policy of segregation. That was permissible, but we never did it thoroughly or honestly. We set aside 1/10 of the land for 4/5 of the people. Thus, we made it inevitable. And some say we did it knowingly, that labor would come to the towns. We are caught in the toils of our own selfishness. No one wishes to make the problem seem smaller than it is. No one wishes to make its solution seem easy. No one wishes to make light of the fears that beset us. But whether we be fearful or no, we shall never, because we are a Christian people, be able to evade the moral issues. And then it goes on, but Mr. Jarvis isn't able to find the other pages. But I think that part of the manuscript really helps Mr. Jarvis to understand how dedicated his son was. And it helps us to see just how tragic this whole situation is. This man that was that had his heart so deep into helping the native situation, and then a native actually ends up killing him, is just tragic. But you could tell that Mr. Jarvis' son was heavily influenced by the work of Abraham Lincoln. And after reading that and being in his son's house, Mr. Jarvis leaves just sad and confused. And I think we can all understand that feeling that he's having. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 20.